There's a grave that's over 100,000 years old. Inside it, a child, surrounded by shells, red ochre, and what researchers believe were flowers. No written language existed, no formal religion, no priests or ceremonies we'd recognize today. So who taught these people to bury their dead? And why did they care? Death is the one experience every human civilization has ever had to face. And yet, for most of history, we assumed our ancient ancestors simply didn't think much about it, that they just left their dead and moved on. But the archaeological record tells a completely different story.
Across every continent, in caves, riverbeds, and open plains, there is evidence that humans, long before cities, long before writing, were doing something deliberate when a member of their group died. The question is, what were they doing, and what does it tell us about who we were? The oldest confirmed intentional burial discovered so far dates back roughly 300,000 years, and it didn't come from our species. In 2023, researchers working in a cave system in South Africa called Rising Star announced something that rewrote the timeline. Deep inside a chamber, nearly impossible to reach, they found the remains of Homo naledi, a small-brained hominin that scientists had previously assumed wasn't cognitively capable of symbolic behavior.
But the remains showed signs of deliberate placement. The bodies weren't dragged there by predators. There were no scavenger marks. The positioning was careful. This suggests that the impulse to honor the dead may predate Homo sapiens entirely. For decades, Neanderthals were treated as brutish and unfeeling. The idea that they buried their dead was controversial, dismissed as coincidence, as natural cave collapses, as wishful thinking by scientists who wanted them to be more like us. Then came Shanidar Cave in Iraq.
Excavated in the 1950s and revisited in recent decades, this site contained Neanderthal skeletons in positions that seemed intentional, curled, arranged, sometimes accompanied by clusters of pollen that suggested flowers had once been placed nearby. The flower interpretation is still debated. Some researchers argue the pollen arrived through burrowing rodents, others maintain the pattern is too deliberate to dismiss. But here's what's harder to argue with. At Shanidar, one of the individuals had severe physical disabilities, a withered arm, likely blind in one eye, evidence of healed injuries that would have required long-term care to survive. Someone kept that person alive for years. That's not the behavior of a species with no emotional capacity.
When anatomically modern humans began leaving clearer burial evidence around 100,000 years ago in sites like Kafza Cave in Israel, the behavior becomes unmistakable. Red ochre stains the bones, shell ornaments appear near the remains, bodies are positioned with what researchers describe as intention and care. By 30,000 years ago, burials had become elaborate. The Sungir site in Russia, dated to roughly that period, contained 2 children buried head-to-head, covered in over 10,000 hand-drilled mammoth ivory beads. Crafting those beads would have taken an estimated 10,000 hours of labor. Think about that. A community that had to hunt for survival, that faced harsh winters and constant danger. They spent the equivalent of a full year of work, honoring 2 children who had died.
Here's where the story becomes more complex. Burial wasn't universal. Not every ancient culture placed their dead in the ground, and many of the alternatives were just as deliberate. Some groups practiced sky burials, leaving the body elevated or exposed so that birds and natural elements could return it to the earth. Evidence of this kind of excarnation, the deliberate defleshing of bones before secondary burial, has been found at sites across Europe and Asia. In some regions, the bones were collected after decomposition and kept near the living community. Ancestors were not sent away, they were stored, remembered through proximity. Other communities dismembered and redistributed remains across significant locations, possibly to connect the dead to the land, to mark territory, or to bind a group together through shared ritual. The point is, there was no single ancient answer, but every group had one. And the more archaeologists dig, the less death looks like an ending and more like a conversation ancient humans refused to stop having. What makes human death practices truly striking isn't just the physical care, it's the evidence of meaning-making. Across ancient sites, researchers have found grave goods, tools, food, personal items, objects that had no practical purpose in a burial context. They were placed there for someone, for the person who had died. This implies belief, or at minimum, uncertainty. Ancient humans weren't sure what death was. They didn't know if the person was truly gone, so they packed provisions. They covered the body with pigment that may have symbolized blood, life, or protection. They oriented graves toward the rising sun. One study of Paleolithic burial sites found a recurring pattern. Bodies in certain regions were consistently positioned facing east. No written instruction survived. No text explained why, but the pattern was there, repeated, consistent, intentional. Ritual without writing is still ritual. Here's the deeper question these burials force us to ask. What kind of mind does this require? To bury the dead deliberately, you need to understand that the person is gone, permanently. You need a concept of death itself, which is not as simple as it sounds. Many animals react to dead companions with distress or confusion, but deliberate burial suggests something further, that these ancient humans understood the finality of death and still chose to respond with care. Cognitive scientists describe this as theory of mind, the capacity to attribute experience, identity, and continuity to others. It's foundational to empathy, to culture, to language. The moment ancient humans began treating their dead as something more than biological matter, they were already thinking symbolically. They were already building a world inside their heads that extended beyond the visible, the immediate, the certain. In a sense, the first graves weren't just resting places. They were the earliest physical proof that humans had developed an inner life rich enough to grieve. What started as a question about what ancient people did when someone died has become something larger. Because the answer isn't just they buried them. The answer is they recognized them as a person, as someone whose absence mattered, as someone worth remembering. Long before any religion codified the afterlife, long before any government wrote laws about the deceased, long before any philosopher articulated the concept of the soul, ordinary humans in caves and open fields and frozen steppes were already working through the hardest question any conscious being ever faces, and they were doing it together. The grave isn't just where someone ends. For ancient humans, it appears to have been where community, belief, and the very concept of a self that outlasts a body first began. We tend to think of ancient humans as simpler versions of ourselves, less refined, less aware. But every ochre-stained skeleton, every bead-covered child, every carefully arranged body in a cave that took hours to reach tells a different story. They felt what we feel. They didn't want to let go either. And maybe that's the most human thing of all. Not the tools we built, not the fires we lit, but the fact that when we lost someone, we stopped, we marked it. We said, this person was here, and their being here mattered. That impulse hasn't changed in 300,000 years.